Hello, hello. Welcome back to B&J's Little Farm. How is everybody today? We've got Steve in the house and Brian. Hello, hello. Tonight we are on chapter 37 of Wings of a Dream. Just waiting for a couple more people to pop in. And we'll get started. That didn't work. There it goes. That was weird. Hey, Brian. Good to see you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We are on chapter 37, like I said. Here we go. Mama sat rigid in the front seat of the buggy long before Frank and I managed to get the children readied for church and out the door. Daddy sat behind Dandy with a grim smile. His eyes met Frank's, and what seemed to be a hesitant handshake, some sort of agreement not spoken aloud. Good to see you too, Brian. I climbed up beside Mama. Frank set Janie in my lap before squeezing in the back with the rest of his children, as if he were a child himself instead of the owner of the convent, the convey, and the master of all he surveyed. Hey, Sideshow. Ooh, Brian gifted one membership. Thank you so much, Brian. He'd put himself in the lower place to avoid unleashing Mama's tongue. Not many men would do so. Mama's presence on our journey hushed even the smallest voices. I don't think even a bird dared chirp as we passed. And as the buggy wheels devoured each inch of road, another part of me tightened. The people of Prater's Junction had become my friends. Would Mama turn up her nose at them, or would she cultivate their good graces and push me more firmly toward the sheriff's arms? I lifted my thumbnail to my mouth. Mama gently pushed my hand back down. I hope your preacher isn't in the habit of spinning longer sermons, Mr. Gresham, she said. Silence answered. No, ma'am. Brother Latham is always very timely, not too short and not too long. I chewed my bottom lip, hoping my answer would stifle her comments. Such a nice man, that sheriff. He's a man a girl could depend on. Don't you agree, Mr. Gresham? Help me, Lord, help me. Help me, Lord. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from screaming. I waited for Frank to say something, anything. Mama turned her head. Don't you agree, mister? Look, Mama, there's a red bird. Where? She whipped around like a distracted child. I breathed out of relief as I pointed out the church steeple instead. I sat between Mama and Daddy in the pew, the children between Daddy and Frank. After the service, I didn't give Mama any choice. about being sociable. I took her arm and introduced her to Doc Reisinger and Mr. and Mrs. Crenshaw and the Culpeper clan. Each one greeted her not only with kindness, but gave her a memory of the time with her sister. Did she realize that Annabelle hadn't apparently made their estrangement a topic of conversation among her neighbors and friends? As Daddy took Mama's hand and led her to the buggy, Frank slid up beside me, sending my heart into a spirit. I asked the Lathams to dinner. Will we have enough to feed everyone? I sighed. I expect, but I wish you'd have told me sooner. I know, I'm sorry. I just couldn't stand another meal. I mean, I know she's your mother, but I laid my hand on his arm. You don't have to explain or apologize. He nodded once, his eyes raking over the field of headstones. Mama hadn't even asked to visit her sister's grave. 3 chickens, fried crispy, a heaping pot of potatoes, mashed with butter and salt, cornbread and green beans cooked with bacon. Even Mama couldn't find anything to complain about. And because of that, and free around conversation flew free around the dinner table. Bellies full, the men sauntered off to the barn. Miss Hendricks, why don't you rest a bit? It's been a full day, I know. Irene led Mama to the parlor while I washed dishes. How are you? She whispered on her return. I almost answered fine, as if reciting school lesson by route, but the look on Irene's face told me she knew things I hadn't even spoken of. It's it's all right, honey. I know some about your mother. Your aunt and I were friends, remember? And I had a mother too. Her eyes twinkled as if she'd read every thought in my head since Mama stepped into the house. Some hours are better than others. I drank a so I dunked a soapy plate beneath the rinse water. Irene laughed in her usual way. I handed her a dripping plate. And what about Frank? How's he doing with all this? She stacked the dried plates on the table with the others. I plunged my hands beneath the warm water, seeking another dish to scrub. As good as can be, I expect. She sighed as she wiped another dish and set it aside. Will you go with your parents when they leave? My knees threatened to give way. I grabbed the edge of the dish tub. I can't go home with them, Irene. I just can't. She smiled at me, a weary smile. Sometimes the Lord asks us to do hard things. My back stiffened, strength surging back into my legs. He can't ask me to go home again. He brought me here. I know it. My gaze faltered from her face. I have to stay for a while longer at least. She lifted the stack of clean dishes. I'm praying for you, Rebecca. Don't ever forget that. I dried my hands as Irene disappeared into the dining room. Maybe God would hear her prayer. I certainly didn't feel as if he had heard mine. Just before noon that day, Frank rode back into the yard. I followed him around to the corral, pulled like kerosene up a dry wick. He swung down, set Dandy loose in the pen. My eyes lit on his, but something dark answered back. I bit my lip and looked away. Rebecca? Yes, I turned back, too eager. He led me away from the barn. I went to town this afternoon. I held my breath, his face hovering over inches above mine. Mr. Crenshaw said you brought the children Christmas presents on my account. I nodded, afraid to look into his eyes, lest their blue turn stormy gray. Brian says, Hey, Barrett.
Hey, Brian.
He settled his hands on his hips, aspirated like, Why in the world didn't you just pay cash? I picked at a crust of tea cake on the skirt of my dress because there wasn't any to pay with. No cash in your letters. None in the house, none in the bank. I raised my eyes to his, not caring what I'd see. What would you have had me to do? Let me think. Santa Claus forgot them? Of course, there was the $2 wasted in Dallas, but irrational hid my embarrassment. Daddy would repay Frank his precious money if I had asked him to. I glared up at him, expecting wrath, but something new crossed his face: surprise, admiration. His laugh started low and worked itself into a regular guffaw. Heat curled up my face as he shook his head and wiped his eyes. I heard about your visit to the bank. You certainly have gumption. Is that a good thing? He blinked, surprise. Then a smile started on his lips and ended in his eyes. Yes, why? Yeah, why, yes, I guess it is. I couldn't hold back my grin, so I studied the ground. Don't worry, he laid a hand on my shoulder. I didn't move away. I, I didn't move away. I covered it all with Mr. Crenshaw today. I guess Aunt Annabelle didn't tell you about the tin box under the floorboard in the bedroom. Relief washed over me. Money had been there all along. Dan suddenly tugged at my hand. Come on, Becca. Daddy and Uncle Lloyd are taking us fishing. Right, Daddy? Uncle Lloyd? I looked at Frank. He shrugged. Your father suggested it. You coming with us, Becca? Dan pressed his hands together as if in a prayer. Please, please, Becca. Frank seemed as anxious as his son for my answer. Elation coursed through me, almost raising my feet from the ground. I opened my mouth to say yes. Rebecca, Mama's voice pulled my attention toward the house. Rebecca Grace, where have you gotten to? When my gaze returned to Frank, his sunny expression had darkened to a thundercloud. My hands turned to ice in spite of unhindered sun. I'm sorry, I whispered. I ran towards the house, toward Mama, all the while hating myself for wishing she'd never come. Thank you, Brian. Make a shout out to Brian for sharing me out. Appreciate it. That night, the parlor felt as stiffening as a kitchen in August. With kids in bed, Mama worked at her needlepoint. Daddy read the paper. Frank stared at the almanac, but I never saw him turn a single page. I, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. I fanned myself with Better Homes and Gardens until Mama frowned at me. Then I wandered from one end of the room to the other, finally opening the sash and sticking my head into the cool night air. Rebecca, put down that window. I turned around, but didn't comply. Mama's needlepoint dropped into her lap. Lloyd, it's fine, Margaret. He turned the page and kept reading. It was getting warm in here. I spied James's good pair of pants in the sewing basket next to the sofa. I ought to mend them before Sunday. Without much enthusiasm, I settled down to work. Mama didn't prattle on about the women's forum or church or gossip from town like she did in the evenings in Downingtown. Nor did she question Daddy about politics or finance matters. It wasn't like her to be so quiet. The silence prickled at my nerves as painfully as my needle on the thimbleless finger. The clock chimed 9. Had it only been an hour, Daddy folded the newspaper, cleared his throat. We'll be heading home tomorrow. My head jerked up. So did Mama's. Had Daddy's announcement shocked her that much or not at all? I couldn't tell. So soon, the words came out before I thought. I clamped my lips shut. Mama rolled up her needlepoint. And of course, you'll be coming with us, Rebecca Grace. The words I'd been waiting for but didn't want to hear. Hey, Carl, good to see you. Frank looked as taut as a laundry line. I shoved James's pants back into the basket, trying to keep my voice steady. I I hadn't planned to. But you can't stay here alone. Her gaze raced back and forth between Frank's face and mine. It's unseemly. Frank clenched his fist, his eyes flashing anger. He looked like a cat ready to pounce. No one around here seems to think such a thing. Your daughter has cared for my children. I happen to think the Lord sent her here on their behalf. My head jerked up. Did he really believe that? Mama stared at Frank as if she'd never seen him before. No color lit her cheeks, but a slight tremor moved her lips. Yet you've ruined her all the same. I gasped, Mama, I don't intend to take advantage of your daughter in any way at all, Miss Hendricks. An edge hard as an iron encased his words. I sucked in a breath and held it. I guarantee you'll have your daughter home before the end of March. Almost 6 weeks. What was he planning to do between now and then? Court a new wife? Hire a new housekeeper? Would he let me be privy to his plans, or did he think I would need to know what would become of his children? Are y'all going to plan my whole life for me? Don't I have any say? I jammed my fists on my hips, my cheeks burning. Daddy crossed the room, took Mama by the hand. You're welcome to come with us, Rebecca, but I'm thinking Frank could use your help. But Mama bit off her words at Daddy's look. We can trust Rebecca to do what is right, Margaret. Fine, but if she stays, I'm buying her a ticket home myself. She glared at Frank. You can pick it up at the station on the next trip to town. In an instant, Frank and I were alone. I couldn't look at him. I feared he'd read too much in my expression. He knew I couldn't go back and marry Barney Graves, and he'd seen that Sheriff Jeffries didn't stir more than friendship in my soul. He'd recognized that somewhere in the past few weeks I'd gone and fallen in love with a farmer. I sat hard on the sofa. Are you staying or going? His voice made me tremble. I pretended it was the night air and jumped up to close the window. But the sash wouldn't budge. His arms reached over me, slid the window shut before he sat on the arm of the sofa. Staying or going? I moistened my lips, my gaze falling everywhere but directly on him. He moved to the mantel, poked at the embers. The shadowed skin that circled beneath his eyes taunted me as Mama and Daddy's voice rumbled from the next room, then quieted. I took a deep breath and steadied my gaze on Frank's face. I told James I would never leave. Not yet. Daddy reached into his pocket before he left the next morning and pulling out a fold of paper money. He peeled away 5 $1 bills and handed them to me. For anything you need, baby girl. He kissed me on the cheek before he helped Mama into the Latham's buggy. Tears rose and retreated in my eyes as quickly as shallow puddles after a midsummer rain. I couldn't do what Mama wanted. I made a commitment to the Lord to stay here until he made it clear I should leave. If the end of March came and I had no other option, only then would I return to Downington. I had 39 days to figure out the rest of my life. I'd mark them off on a piece of paper one by one. James's hand had slipped into mine. His eyes danced, so much like his daddy's, only lighter in color, so clear in speaking their need. How would I ever say goodbye? Mama did indeed buy my ticket home before she left, even sent it back to me with Mr. Culpepper instead of waiting for Frank to pick it up. I stared at it later that afternoon, a lump forming in my throat. I turned to find Frank standing behind me, his eyes also fixed on the ticket, and it seemed from that moment on I couldn't get him out from underfoot. Chapter 38. I gathered the wrung out sheet and placed it in the basket to carry to the clothesline. Beside me, Frank fed another sheet through the wringer and fished in the wash pot for more. So, do you often help Aunt Annabelle with laundry? I tapped my foot against the hard dirt. The surprise on his face told me all I needed to know. He nodded toward the basket at my feet. You ready to hang those? Yes, I tilted my head. Do you want help? I can. He wiped his hands on his jeans. Let me douse the coals of this fire first. I picked up the basket and headed for the clothesline, calling to the boys and Janie, who played far from the fire and the clothes wringer. They appeared for a moment, cheeks brightened by the cool air. I sent them into the house to warm up a bit, even as I considered shedding my own coat. I then truggled around the side of the house, set the basket on the ground, and pulled the clothespins near. Maybe if I got this all done quickly, Frank would leave me alone. Not that I didn't enjoy his nearness, I enjoyed it far too much, and that made it harder to push him from my mind. I jammed a clothespin over a fold of cloth on the line. Help me, Lord. Help me. Help me to trust your plans. Halfway through the task, Frank appeared again, his easy grin spinning my stomach and thumping my heart. His hand brushed mine, tingling the skin all the way up my arm. I guess you hadn't had any driving adventures lately. He picked up one of Janie's dresses, so small in his hands. He frowned at it, turned it upside down, then right side up. Let me help. I took the dress from him, shook it out, hung the shoulders over the line, and pinned them in place. Then I shook out one of Ollie's dresses. No, no driving lately. Did you tell your mother about that adventure? He chuckled as he pinned one of Dan's small shirts to the line. No, I laughed, reaching for another piece of clothing. She'd never understand that. I imagine not. He was amused, his amused glance in my direction. But you'd do it again, wouldn't you? I stopped working, faced him full on. Yes, I would. I'd like to drive more, all by myself. A smile tugged a smile tugged at the corner of my lips. Of course, I do my best not to knock down your fence again. His eyes shone with held in laughter, and I thank you for that. Pulling my gaze from his, I reached for another item from the basket. Do you Have you ever thought about buying a car? My brother had one, a Model T. He bought it before he left for France. Mama mentioned he took it with him on his last adventure. Maybe he sold it to pay for the words stuck in my throat, but I imagine Frank would understand. Tell me about your home. My home? It took me a moment to realize he didn't mean here. When I had when had I come to think of this place as home? I shook away my shock. Downington? He nodded and kept working. It's not much different than Prater's Junction, really. I guess you miss your friends there? Friends? He's He'd edge closer to me now, the basket resting at the far end of the line. I scooted toward the porch, eased down on the step, leaving him to hang the last few things. I didn't have any close friends there. Really? I imagined you to be in the center of social whirlwind. That would be Mama, not me, I sighed. I thought maybe if I were in a bigger place with more to do, more people to meet, life would be more exciting without Mama to direct everything. But it's likely that's not meant to be. I'm sure you're appreciated wherever you are. His gaze captured mine, held it even as he picked up the empty basket. Dan trampled onto the porch. We're all hungry, Becca. Is it dinner soon? I pushed to my feet. Yes, it's dinner soon. Frank stepped between his son and me. But first, Dan is going to ask nicely, aren't you, Dan? The child sighed with his whole body, arms and shoulder and head, heavying up, then shrugging down. Yes, sir. He turned to me. Becca, can we please have dinner soon? My belly is growling something awful. I bypassed Frank and lifted Dan so he and I could see each other face to face. Let's heat up some coffee for your daddy while we get dinner on the table. Dan grinned. Warmth spread from my fingertips to my toes. If only I could convince myself it was lit by Dan's grin alone and not by his father's nearness. Other chores called Frank from the house more often than not. for the next few days. At first, I felt more comfortable, but loneliness crept in right behind, and fear. I wondered when exactly Frank planned to tell the children I'd be leaving. I felt sure he had some plan. Whether more like spring, then winter arrived as February continued. 34 days remained on my makeshift calendar. I wiped an arm across my forehead, drying the preparation sparkled from the blazing stove. Janie whined in the corner, her face pink with heat. The boys and Frank would be worn out in the fields too, and thirsty. Water would cool them. But then I spied 2 lemons Frank had picked up at the Crenshaw store. He'd had a hankering for lemonade, he said. I'd laugh. Lemonade in February, but it didn't seem so outrageous on a day like today. It wouldn't take long, and the water from the christen would be cool enough without ice. I mixed it up in a jiffy, then lifted Janie onto my hip, securing her with one arm, carrying the bucket of lemonade with the other, a ladle for dipping it out hanging from the pocket of my apron. Janie clapped her hands and laughed as we walked through the barnyard and towards the fields. Almost 1 year old, and still no discernible word. Birdie! See the birdie, Janie? Bah, bah, bah. She pointed and blabbered something else. I pretended to understand. Daddy, we're going to see your daddy. Nothing. She just bounced in my arms, nearly knocking me off balance. I held the bucket a bit tighter, determined to steady it to arrive without spilling a drop. The fields did indeed look ready for something, not like when I had first seen them, with their crops newly harvested. My stomach clenched at the reminder spread out before me. Frank was a farmer. He led a farmer's life, a life I longed to escape. I set Janie on the ground, but kept hold of her hand. Frank and the boys huddled farther off, their backs to us, bent toward the ground, intent on something. I lifted my chin and marched forward. Frank had no intentions toward me. He'd said that before. My parents arrived, and again during their visit. Frank turned, straightened. His slow smile made me want to turn and run. I wouldn't be tethered to the land. I would find a life that mattered, a life with an open door to adventure to change. What have we here? Frank lifted his daughter high in the air. Her laughter crackled through the clear air, twisting my heart. If Frank didn't want me, I wouldn't have these children either. I thrust my bucket into the space between us, lemonade sloshing onto the dirt beneath. I thought you'd all like something cool to drink. He sat Janie on his shoulders, letting her pound his hat further down on his head. I handed him the dipper. He drank, eyes widened. Then he handed a full ladle to James. Lemonade? Boy, howdy, does it taste good? The boys slurped down their share, as did Janie. When my bucket grew light, I reached for Janie's tiny hand. We best be getting back to get dinner ready. Frank nodded, that lopsided little boy grin never leaving his face. I bit my lip and stared at the dirt, begging my heart to be still, to be reasonable, to understand that I couldn't want him, couldn't want this. But like an unruly child, it refused to obey, and like an exasperated mother, my irritation flowered into anger. By the time we'd finished dinner and Frank and the boys left the house again, I had to calm my agitation, and I knew a surefire way to do that: scrubbing floors. Hey, Watt Life, good to see you. Ollie arrived home from school, dropped her books in the hall, and shuffled slowly into the parlor. Ollie? No answer. I didn't have the energy to fight her. I left the books where they lay. Yeah, please. Thank you. I left the books where they lay and moved into the far corner of the dining room, the final room. I returned to my knees, scrubbing away the dirt, even though my shoulders and my back and my arms ached. But the exhaustion kept my mind off other things, like the man who loved this farm and his children. I sat back on my heels, wondering how I'd find the energy to cook supper. Maybe Ollie could help out. Dan held on to the wall, his head poking through the doorway. My heart danced at the sight of him. Even in my tiredness, he seemed so much more grown up than when I'd first come 4 months ago. Was that possible? I tiptoed across the dining room and pulled him to me. The scar on his head couldn't be seen anymore unless you searched for it. Ollie's shivering, Becca, shivering. I hadn't noticed it had grown colder, but I'd worked myself into a sweat. He wiggled through he wiggled free from my grasp, shivering under 3 quilts. He shoved 3 pudgy fingers in my face. I rubbed my forehead. Thank goodness the Spanish influenza was no longer a threat. I would isolate her from the others and slather the Vicks vapor rub on her chest. I wished I still had a lemon to squeeze into hot water with some honey. My teeth searched for some scrap of thumbnail to gnaw on. Where's your daddy, Dan? He shrugged. Said he and Brother Latham had to go somewhere, but he'd be back before supper. Just when I needed Frank, he wasn't there. No matter. I'd make Ollie rest, and she'd be better in no time. You and James take Janie to the kitchen and play patty cake with her. After I take care of Ollie, we'll fix supper. Dan nodded with some solemnity of an old man before darting off yelling for James and Janie. I found Ollie under a mountain of quilts in the parlor, her dull eyes staring through me. I pressed my hands against her cheeks. Her skin flamed hotter than a smithly forge, setting my stomach to quivering. Quilts and all, I managed to get her into her mother's bedroom. As I pulled back the clean sheets, her eyes widened. Am I dying? I sat beside her on the bed, scolding myself for scaring her. No, honey. I stroked back the little hairs that curled around her face as I pulled the sheet over her shaking form. I just wanted you someplace warm and easy to get to, and away from all the others. We don't want them getting sick too, do we? She shook her head and shut her eyes. I'm going to brew you some tea, and then you're going to sleep. You'll be fine, I promise. Her weak smile right at my heart, ripped at my heart, as she curled into herself and turned away. Where's Ollie? Frank eased into the chair at the head of the kitchen table. I turned from the stove and set the pot of beans on the table, ready to spoon them onto plates. She's not feeling well. If you'd been here earlier, you'd know that. Where'd that come from? Even I hadn't paid Ollie much attention at all until Dan had alarmed me, but I wouldn't tell Frank that. I put her in the downstairs bedroom. His chair scraped across the floor before his feet thumped across the hall. The bedroom door creaked open and clicked shut. Even though I couldn't see his face in that moment, I imagined it all too well. When he returned to the table, his silence prickled the hairs on my arms. Had I missed something? Was Ollie worse off than I'd imagined? The cornbread seemed to lodge in my throat, cutting off my breath. I carried my half full plate to the slop bucket and scraped it in. I didn't care if Mama said waste was a sin. Another mouthful, and I feared it would all come back up anyway. I wiped my hands on my apron. I'll check on Ollie. Before Frank could answer, I'd left the room, my insides as agitated as cream in a churn. But Ollie seemed some better when I reached her side, not quite as hot to the touch or as restless. I sank into the chair next to the bed, the same one from which I watched Aunt Ada Bell die. I thought lifted me to my feet. I splashed water on my face and pinched color into my cheeks before I forced my feet to keep moving across the floor around the bed. My nerves might be frayed to the edge, but I refused to let Frank see that. Frank, my hand ran over the top of the combination bookcase across the front of the pull down desk where I first read his letters. A sudden chill washed over me. I tried to rub warmth into my arms, but by the time Frank entered the room, my teeth chattered as loudly as always. Hey, Jen, good to see you. He looked from he looked from me to Ollie and back again before pulling a quilt from a trunk in the corner of the room. To my surprise, he laid it around my shoulders. Cold's moving back in. I'll stir up the fire in the next room. It'll help warm this one. I let myself relax into the chair, but then I stood in the open doorway, struggling to control the concern on his face. Should I go for someone? I shook my head, revealing in the fact that he'd asked my advice instead of taking over. Not yet. I think she'll be fine. She already seems better. I'll sit with her through the night just to make sure. He didn't want to leave his daughter, I could tell, but he didn't want to stay in that room either. I could see the anguish in his eyes, as if he imagined his wife's final moments in that same bed. You take care of the others, I'll watch over her. He finally complied, but even after the house quieted, it was deep into the night before I heard his footsteps crunch over the dead grass on his way to the barn. All right, give me just a second. We'll go on to chapter 39, but I need a minute. I'll be right. Okay, chapter 39, and this will be the last one for the evening. A heavy cough shook Ollie's body. It reminded me all too well of the wet rattle of Aunt Annabelle's final moments. If the cough turned deeper, I'd have to boil some water and make her breathe the, the steam. At least I remembered that much from my own childhood bouts of coughing. Night crawled toward day. My head nodded toward my chest. In spite of my concern, I knew a night in the chair wouldn't make for a good morning, so I curled myself on the far corner of the bed. Next thing I knew, I startled awake, heart racing like a train at full speed. The windows remained dark. No noise invaded the house or its environs. I listened for a little while, on alert for whatever had disturbed my slumber. Finally, I eased my head back down, my eyes closing on of their own accord. Then Ollie moaned. I crawled up beside her, felt the heat of her body even through the covers. It's okay, honey. Becca's here. Hands shaking, I fumbled for a match to light the lamp. The flame threw its brightness into the room, illuminating Ollie's face, afire with fever. A smidgen of cold, slippery elm tea remained in the cup by the bed. I held her head and forced the liquid in between her lips. After opening the top of her gown. I dipped my fingers in the Vicks and smeared it over her chest. The sharp methane, men, ugh, the sharp menthol smell cleared the last dregs of dreamland from my head. I'll be right back, honey. Shivering, I stirred the coals in the stove, brewed more tea, took down the bottle of cough medicine, and prayed. I would not panic, and I wouldn't call for help either. Nights were hardest in the sick room. Patients almost always looked better by the daylight of day. I returned to Ollie with fresh tea and a spoonful of medicine. She'd fallen asleep again. I hated to wake her, but after a gentle shake, her eyes opened enough to take both. I sat on the edge of the bed and stroked her wheat colored hair. She snuggled into me as a sick child does her mama. My breath caught in my throat. It's okay, baby. My arm cradled around her as I whispered the words. I leaned back against the iron headboard and lifted my legs to the mattress. Slowly, gently, I spread the quilt over us. Then I closed my eyes and fell fast asleep. Who's fixing breakfast? James wheezed into the bedroom. I'd hardly opened my eyes before Ollie moaned. I hurt all over, Rebecca. Janie, Janie's awake, Dan yelled from the top of the stairs. I put my hand on my head, trying to figure out what to focus on first. How is she? Frank downed the cup of coffee in his hands, cold, I felt sure, and sat in the chair I'd vacated long ago. Who's getting Janie? Dan called again. Then I heard Janie's mad cry. Frank's face looked as haggard as mine felt. Had he slept at all last night? My socked feet hit the chilled floor. Thank you, Brian. He says, don't forget to hit the thumbs up. Becca, Dan again. Make Ollie drink some of that tea, and I was off. A quick breakfast, something to feed Ollie, a cold noon dinner, more tea and coffee. 1 minute in the kitchen, the next in the bedroom, forgetting in one place what I meant to do in the other. Frank appeared oblivious to the chaos. He had eyes only for Ollie now. She labored to breathe, even with the Vicks on her chest and steam in her face. She barely managed to lift her head from the pillow to drink the broth I'd made from a scrawny chicken. Frank bathed his daughter's face as tenderly as any nurse. I took the rag from his hand sometime that afternoon. Go rope with the boys a while. They need you too. He blinked up at me confused, as if he had forgotten he had other children. Then his eyes cleared. You're right. You'll stay with her, won't you? I pushed him towards the hall. Yes. Now go handle the boys and Janie, and I'll watch Ollie. Worry pecked at me while the boys whooped their excitement at their daddy coming to play. We couldn't endure a worse night than the last. I feared she needed the doctor, but while Doc Rising had indeed recovered from his tangle with the Spanish lady, he'd slowed his workload and had sent inquiries for another doctor to come to Prater's Junction. Irene said he hadn't found anyone yet because most of the younger doctors hadn't returned from France. The sun dipped closer to the earth. Daylight would disappear in a few hours. I lost my place. Frank, I hope he would hear my call over the boys' squabbling. He did. In fact, he came dragging each boy by the shirt collar. I kept my voice calm, though I wanted to shriek. I think we need to call I think we need to get the doctor and maybe Irene. Frank's fingers unclenched, leaving the boys free. Without a word, he charged into the pinking light. I watched from the window until I couldn't see even a speck of him in the distance. Ollie groaned out my name. I returned to the little mound in the middle of the big bed. James, take the little one to the parlor and keep them there. Okay, but the fire The fire's almost dead. The fires almost died away. Of course, I hurried in, poked the logs, and fanned in the flames. The moment I returned to Ollie's side, my knees hit the floor by the bed, fingers clutching at one another, squeezing until pressure cramped my hands. Please, please, dear Jesus. I grabbed fistfuls of the quilt now and lowered my face against their colored patches. We can't put her in the ground, too. The boys and Janie made more noise than a pack of dogs treeing a coon. I hushed them, managing to get more tea and medicine into Ollie before she drifted to sleep once more. Building blocks still banged from the next room, but at least they tried to keep their voices quiet. And still, the sun lit the window. It seemed like it'd been forever since Frank disappeared from my sight, and yet it also felt like only a moment. I wondered if God had stopped the sun in the sky as he had for Joshua and the children of Israel. But just as the thought entered my mind, the sun dropped behind the horizon and the earth fell into a shadow. I needed light to fight off the darkness. But for the lamps to burn again, I had to trim wicks, and I hadn't made time. Truth be told, Ollie often did that job, but now my little helper lay too weak to rise from her bed. I poured kerosene into the clear bowl, trimmed the wicks, and torched it with a burning match. Light glowed bigger as I replaced the chimney. Dan appeared at my side. I think Janie's scared of the dark. As I picked up the lamp and plunged into the hall, the darkness peeled back, giving way to light. James and Dan herded Janie to the kitchen while I remembered all the sermons I'd heard about Jesus being a light in the darkness, showing us the way. Stumbling through the hall and into the kitchen, I brightened another lamp, dispelling the dark within each reach. Had I let Jesus illuminate my path, or had I tried to make my own light? I refused to let myself dwell on the subject, but it loomed up in the glooming, forcing a confirmation. Had I mistaken my own light for God's leading? Maybe. It seemed I'd completely misread God's plan for me. My heart had yearned toward the wrong thing, and now it pined for what I insisted it didn't want. But still, Aunt Annabel had believed and said with her dying breath that God had brought me here to this very place. I poured milk, cut cornbread. Janie whined, her hands pulling at my skirt. I lifted her into my arms. She Her shape shimmered before me as I heard Irene's voice in my head. Life has a way of surprising you sometimes. My heart swelled, pushing tears into my eyes. I beckoned Dan and James to my side, pulled them in, held them tight. Dan wiggled away first. When will Daddy get back? He said. We'd build a tower of blocks before bed. Soon, Dan. He'll be back soon. Please, God, let him come back soon. As if in immediate answer to my prayer, the kitchen door banged open against the wall. Frank hung his hat on the peg, but it fell to the floor. He yanked the gloves from his hands, his bare fingers reaching for mine. Irene's coming. What did she say? I gripped his hands more tightly, surprised at his touch, gritty for his strength. She's not far behind in the wagon. I came through the field. It was faster. I poured out hot coffee and handed him a cup. He savored that first drink, and then his eyes found mine. They had a visitor. Didn't wait to find out who. He took Brother Latham to get the doc. Doc rising, fever, cough, chills. The nightmare had returned, but at least this time I didn't have to face it alone. Hey, Firefly! Irene, Frank, and I watched and prayed and nursed Ollie half the night before Doc Rising arrived. His skin looked thin, as paper in the lamplight as he leaned across the bed and examined Ollie. He gathered the rest of us in one corner of the room. I'd hoped the scourge had passed over us, but I was wrong. My skin pricked. What do you mean? His wiry hair, withered now than when we had first met, stuck out from all ends. Spanish flu. I've even I've seen enough of it now to recognize it. I shook my head and backed toward the wall. She can't have that. My hand crept to my throat, my whispers resounding until they ceased being whispers at all. It's gone. No one in these parts has it anymore. Rebecca. Frank shook my shoulders in his hands. Doc's here. Just let him. He doesn't know. He just a doddering old man. Can't you see? She needs a real doctor. Ollie moaned. I pushed past Frank and rushed to the bedside. Do something. Help her. My shrieks filled the room before Irene slapped me right across the face. I stared at her in silent shock, just as she intended. Then her voice broke through, calm and gentle as the April dawn. You have to be strong, Rebecca. She glanced quickly at Frank's pale face before raising her eyebrows at me. And then she pushed her arm around my waist. Why don't you go upstairs and rest? We'll take care of Ollie. I whimpered like a kicked puppy, but one look at Frank's red rimmed eyes composed me. He looked as if a stout wind would blow him over. I'll be quiet, I promise. Good girl. Irene nodded as I sank down next to the bed, folded my hands, and begged God to give me the flu instead of Ollie. For 2 straight nights, I fell asleep on my knees, my head resting on the mattress. When I woke the third day, a yellow streak of sun streamed in through the window and fell across Ollie's body. Doc Reisinger and Irene had cautioned me that we might not know the severity of the illness for several days, but as long as the purple spots didn't appear, there was hope. I studied Ollie's thin face, pale from forehead to chin, but no darkening tones. I forced my legs to straighten and my head to change direction. I staggered into the kitchen. Irene and Frank sat at the table, drinking coffee. Irene poured me a cup as well. I sipped it, plain black. Irene laid her hand on mine. She's holding her own. I tried to smile, but my lips refused to obey. Ooga, ooga. Before the others could move, I bolted for the porch, waving my hands for the visitor to cease his noise. One of the older Latham boys hopped from the running board of Mr. Culpepper's automobile. Tell Mama to come quick. Beulah's sick. So's Daddy. Irene must have been standing behind me. She bustled down the walk and hurried in her step, the only indication of crisis. She even managed to remember to wave goodbye as she climbed in beside Mr. Culpepper. Little Beulah, I licked moisture to my lips as I reached for the common holding the porch roof overhead, but my hands landed on Frank instead. His arms closed around me. I buried my head in his chest. All I could think was that I'd sent Ollie to school carrying the Spanish flu. All right. That's the end of today's reading. I want to thank you all for coming out and listening. I really appreciate it. Next Saturday, we will be on chapter 40. Until next time, remember, you are loved. Stay happy, healthy, and safe. And I will see you later. Bye.